When civilization collapses, everyone talks about water purification and shelter building. But what nobody tells you is far darker. The real survival threat isn't starvation, it's what humans become when the rules disappear. Today on Throne of Horrors, we're uncovering the forgotten survival horror that history buried, the psychological warfare tactics of collapsing societies, the cannibalism that wasn't hunger-driven, and the predatory hierarchies that form in hours, not years. These are the survival truths that wilderness guides will never teach you because they're too terrifying to acknowledge. Let's start with something that happened in real time, documented and impossible to deny. During the Great Irish Famine of the 1840s, survival wasn't about foraging techniques. Ireland had food. Shipments of grain and cattle left the island daily, bound for England, while 1 million people starved. The actual survival problem was social collapse. Families turned on each other. Mothers left their children on doorsteps. The young murdered the elderly for their rations. This wasn't desperation. This was hierarchy restructuring in real time. When the normal framework of law and consequence vanishes, humans don't cooperate. They predate. Modern survival fiction gets this backwards. It shows people banding together, building community gardens, sharing resources. That's not what happened in Leningrad during the 900-day siege. That's not what happened in the Andes plane crash. That's not what happened in the Donner Party. What happened was this. Survival became currency. Information about food location became weaponized. Family units became predator groups. And the worst part? The ones who survived longest were often the ones who abandoned morality first. Here's what your wilderness survival expert won't tell you. In 1944, at the Auschwitz camp, prisoners were given an impossible choice. A small daily ration that couldn't sustain life. You could work and eat a little, or be selected for death. The psychological trap wasn't the lack of food, it was that survival required becoming complicit in the system. Some prisoners, called capos, were given slightly better rations in exchange for enforcing discipline on other prisoners. They became enforcers of the horror itself. They survived longer. The moral cost? Irrelevant. History shows us that in collapse scenarios, the most effective survivors are often the ones least burdened by conscience. Now let's examine the Donner Party specifically, because their story wasn't about wilderness survival. It was about the predatory hierarchy that formed in 48 hours. In November 1846, 2 wagon families became trapped by snow in the Sierra Nevada. They had supplies, they had ammunition, they had rope and tools. What they didn't have was a functioning social order once panic set in. Within days, the group had split into 2 camps. The strong ate the best portions, while the weak were rationed bread and bone broth. When people died of scurvy and starvation, the bodies were preserved. This wasn't desperation, this was hierarchy. The ones who could claim resources dominated. The ones who couldn't died first. The psychological mechanic here is critical. Humans don't become cannibals because they're starving. They become cannibals because someone makes a decision that cannibalism is acceptable, and once that boundary is crossed, the entire social contract collapses. At Donner Lake, it wasn't the hunger that broke people. It was the moment when someone, anyone, decided to eat human flesh. After that, the question wasn't survival. The question was power. Who controlled the cash? Who decided rationing? Who lived and who died? The answer: whoever was willing to kill first. This pattern repeats in every collapse scenario in human history. The 1918 Siege of Mutina in Rome, the Children's Crusade of 1212, the ill-fated Jamestown colony, where starving settlers killed each other for corn stores. The survival advantage always went to whoever could enforce submission first. In Jamestown, Governor Thomas West declared martial law. Deserters were executed publicly. People were whipped for minor infractions. The violence created order, and order, brutal, inhuman order, meant more people survived than would have otherwise. The psychology is this: in true collapse, brutality and hierarchy are survival advantages. But here's the detail that survival guides omit entirely. The people who survived collapses weren't the strongest. They were the most politically aware. They were the ones who understood early that social hierarchy would be rewritten, and they positioned themselves to either enforce it or exploit it. In the Warsaw Ghetto, the Jewish Council was given administrative authority by the Nazis. They had the power to decide who was deported, who was given better rations, who lived and who died. They became inadvertently or otherwise, part of the predatory apparatus. Yet some of them survived precisely because they possessed power. The power to negotiate, to deny, to allocate resources. The modern preparedness movement gets this fundamentally wrong. They focus on water purification tablets, MREs, ammunition, bug-out bags. But none of that matters if you don't understand the political reality of collapse. In every historical scenario we examine, the first people to die are those who 1. Expected morality to persist. They assumed people would share, cooperate, follow rules. 2. Were physically weak or appeared weak. In the Blitz of London, the elderly died first. In the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine of 1932, it was children and the elderly who were targeted first by grain seizures. 3. Were isolated or lacked information networks. Knowledge is survival. The Donner Party members who had contacts in other settlements fared better because they could trade for supplies or escape. 4. Rejected the emerging hierarchy. Those who refused to accept the new order, who tried to maintain the old morality, were marginalized and deprived first. During the Holodomor, Stalin's government seized grain from Ukrainian peasants while they starved. The survival advantage went to those who collaborated: grain requisitioners, communist officials, informants who reported neighbors for hoarding. They received rations while others starved by the millions. This wasn't wilderness survival. This was understanding power structures and positioning yourself within the hierarchy that actually existed, not the one you wished existed. If you want to understand what true survival looks like when systems collapse, you have to accept this uncomfortable truth. Morality is a luxury good. It's something you can only afford when resources are abundant and enforcement mechanisms are in place. The moment scarcity becomes real, morality becomes a liability. The people who understood this early, who recognized that the old rules were dead and began adapting to the new ruthlessness immediately, those people survived. The ones who clung to compassion, fairness, and hope died. Medieval monks documented this psychology explicitly. During the plague years, monasteries, which should have been havens of charity, became predatory institutions. The strong monks received better rations. The sick were isolated and left to die. Some monasteries practiced selective mercy. They would nurse back to health the young monks who could still work, and they would withhold care from the elderly. The moral framework was rationalized. We're protecting the community. We're ensuring survival. We're being pragmatic, but the underlying mechanism was always the same. When scarcity is real, humans become animals. The question is what kind of animal you become. There's a survival technique that old maritime cultures understood, and modern civilization has forgotten: psychological dominance. Ancient sailors knew that the first days of a shipwreck were the critical period for establishing hierarchy. The captain had to immediately assert control. If he wavered, if he showed uncertainty, the crew would fragment into competing factions. Some would try to steal water. Some would attempt mutiny. The entire group would collapse into chaos. But if the captain immediately established brutal rules, rations are rationed by me, disobedience means exile, decisions are not up for discussion, then the group cohered. The captain's certainty created order, and order created survival. This isn't taught in wilderness survival courses because it conflicts with the modern narrative of egalitarianism and group decision-making, but history is absolutely clear. When humans face genuine existential threat, they default to hierarchy. They want someone to tell them what to do. They want certainty, even if the certainty involves deprivation. A strong leader who says, "We're rationing to 1 meal per day and we survive together," creates more survival advantage than a democratic discussion about fairness that leads to paralysis and resource depletion. During the Anasazi collapse in the southwest, around 1300 AD, entire civilizations disappeared. Archaeological evidence shows they didn't die in a single catastrophic event. They fragmented. The central authority, the Pueblo elders and hierarchy, collapsed. Without clear leadership and established rules, the society broke into competing factions. Some communities turned to raiding neighboring groups for resources. Cannibalism appeared in the archaeological record, not because of starvation alone, but because the psychological scaffolding that held civilization together was gone. Once hierarchy dissolved, predation became the default state. Here's what I've found in the historical record repeatedly. People survive collapses, not because they're strong or intelligent. They survive because they understand and adapt to the new power structure faster than others. If you're preparing for actual societal collapse, and I mean real collapse, not a 2-week power outage, you need to understand that your physical skills matter less than your political acumen. You need to know who will emerge as the authority figure. What will be their priority? How can you position yourself to be seen as useful to their agenda? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're the ones that separate the survivors from the corpses. The resource that explains this in brutal detail is something I've linked in the description and pinned in the comments. It's a deep historical analysis of power structures during collapse scenarios, and it goes much further into the psychological mechanics of how hierarchy emerges and how to position yourself within it. Human biology is another angle that wilderness survival courses skip entirely. When you're starving, truly starving, not just hungry, your brain chemistry changes, serotonin drops, aggression increases, empathy decreases. You literally become more violent at the cellular level. The Biafran famine in 1967 created generations of children with permanent neurological changes. They had altered capacity for empathy because their brains developed under chronic malnutrition. What does this mean for survival? It means that in a genuine collapse scenario, within weeks, the population becomes neurologically primed for violence. The kids born during famine are more aggressive. The adults become more territorial. The elderly become less protective of the young. During the 1943 Bengal famine, 3 million people died. And here's the detail that survival guides ignore. It wasn't random. Certain villages survived better than others. The difference wasn't access to resources, it was social structure. Villages with strong patriarchal leaders, older men with established authority, protected their resources more effectively. They enforced strict rationing. They executed thieves publicly. Villages with weaker authority structures, where decision-making was democratic, collapsed faster. The resources got consumed more quickly through arguments about fair distribution. The uncomfortable lesson from Bengal is this: brutal authoritarianism creates better survival outcomes than compassion in acute collapse scenarios. I'm not advocating for cruelty. I'm documenting what the historical record shows us. When you have resources and you have to decide between feeding 10 people for 1 month or 30 people for 2 weeks, the democratic choice leads to everyone starving equally. The authoritarian choice is to feed the 10 and let the 30 die. The 10 survive. More people survive under autocracy and collapse because resources get managed ruthlessly. This is why understanding the psychological component of survival is critical. When the grid goes down, if it ever does, you won't die from lack of water purification knowledge. You'll die because you don't understand that your value in the new society depends entirely on what function you serve in the emerging hierarchy. Are you useful to whoever takes power? Can you contribute labor, knowledge, or skill that they need? Or are you a liability, an extra mouth, a potential threat, or someone unwilling to follow orders? In the medieval period, when plagues wiped out populations and social order fragmented, the survivors weren't the nobles with the fancy education. They were the blacksmiths, the carpenters, the people with practical skills. The baker mattered more than the scholar when people were starving. The person who could make weapons mattered more than the person who could quote philosophy. Skills that directly sustain the hierarchy are survival advantages. But there's another layer. If you're useful, you need to make sure the authority figure knows it. In the siege of Leningrad, some people survived by being part of the Communist Party apparatus, not because they were strong or clever, but because they were useful to the regime. The regime needed administrators, enforcers, information gatherers. If you could fill one of those roles, you got better rations. If you couldn't or wouldn't, you starved with everyone else. This brings us to an essential survival truth that nobody wants to acknowledge. Collaboration is often the key to survival. When the system collapses and a new authority emerges, the people who survive longest are often the ones who work with the new authority. In occupied territories during World War II, collaborators often survived better than resistors. This isn't a moral statement. It's an observation of historical fact. The collaborator gets protection, resources, and status within the new system. The resistor gets identified as a threat and dealt with accordingly. The survival psychology here is brutal but simple. Adapt to the authority structure that actually exists, not the one you wish existed. When the Germans occupied France, French collaborators received rations and protection. French resistors got hunted. More collaborators survived the war than resistors. After the war, the resistors were heroes. During the war, the collaborators were survivors. I need to be clear about something here. I'm not glorifying collaboration or brutality. I'm documenting what the historical record shows us about how humans actually survive existential threats. Understanding this isn't an endorsement, it's realism. If you want to survive genuine collapse, you need to understand that morality will be negotiable. You need to understand that the people who thrive will be those who adapt fastest to the new hierarchy. And you need to understand that the new hierarchy will be brutal because it will need to be. Scarcity forces brutality. This is where the reference materials in the description and pinned comment become essential. They dive deeply into specific historical collapses and show you the exact patterns of hierarchy formation, power consolidation, and resource allocation that separated survivors from victims. If you're seriously considering collapse preparedness, you need to move beyond the wilderness survival mythology. But here's what most collapse narratives get fundamentally wrong. They assume the breakdown of society happens suddenly, a sharp line drawn between before and after. The historical reality is far more insidious. Collapse doesn't announce itself, it creeps. It whispers. It arrives disguised as normalcy, until the moment it becomes undeniable. And by then, the new power structures are already calcifying. Look at what happened during the fall of the Western Roman Empire. This wasn't a day where the empire fell. This was a 70-year process of gradual institutional failure. Tax collection became sporadic. Military payrolls stopped arriving. Trade routes that had operated for centuries simply ceased. Cities that had thrived for 300 years were abandoned in a generation. But nobody woke up one morning saying, well, the empire has fallen. Instead, they woke up realizing that the protections they'd relied on, the guarantee of roads, the certainty of grain shipments, the promise of military response to threats, these things had become luxuries of memory rather than reality. The people who survived best during this collapse weren't the ones who ran to the countryside to build survival shelters. They were the ones who understood the emerging power structure and found a role within it. They attached themselves to warlords. They became essential administrators or merchants in the new fragmented kingdoms. They provided services that the new power holders needed. They made themselves indispensable before indispensability became a matter of survival. And here's the brutal truth that survival guides never address. The skills that matter most in collapse aren't foraging or knot tying. They're psychological and social. Can you read people? Can you lie convincingly? Can you anticipate what a desperate, empowered person will do next? Can you suppress your conscience long enough to do what's necessary? These are the skills that determined who lived and who died when Rome fell. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, didn't fall. It adapted. It centralized power even more aggressively. It created bureaucratic structures so elaborate and so efficient that they could extract resources from a much smaller territory than the West had controlled. The administrative class that served this empire didn't just survive collapse, they thrived in it, because they understood that the game had changed and they repositioned themselves accordingly. This is the lesson that wilderness survival rhetoric actively prevents you from understanding. It teaches you to imagine survival as an individual act, a man against nature, self-sufficiency and stoicism as virtues. But human survival is always a social act. It always involves negotiation, hierarchy, and acceptance of subordination to emergent power structures. The sooner you accept this, the sooner you can actually prepare. Think about what happened after the Black Death. This wasn't a wilderness challenge. This was the opposite. The plague killed so many people, 30 to 50% of Europe's population, that labor became immensely valuable. Suddenly, peasants had leverage. They could demand higher wages. They could negotiate. The entire feudal hierarchy trembled because the scarcity was of human labor rather than food or resources. The survivors weren't the ones who had food stores. They were the ones who recognized that they suddenly held bargaining power and used it ruthlessly. But here's what happened next, and this is critical. The ruling classes recognized the threat to their power. They created wage-fixing laws. They made it illegal to pay laborers more than they'd earned before the plague. They created systems of control to prevent workers from moving to better opportunities. They essentially declared war on the newly empowered survivors to restore the old hierarchy. And many of them succeeded, at least temporarily. This is the psychological pivot you need to make. Stop imagining collapse as a moment when civilization vanishes and a state of nature emerges. Imagine it instead as a moment when existing power structures become unstable and new ones rapidly form. Your survival isn't about having the best knife or knowing which roots are edible. It's about understanding power. The people who survived the collapse of the Soviet Union best weren't the ones with Western survival kits. They were the ones who understood where power was flowing. Some attached to the new oligarchs emerging from the rubble. Others became enforcers for those oligarchs. Still others recognized the value of their technical skills to whoever controlled resources. They weren't thinking about foraging. They were thinking about power. And when real collapse comes, when it's not theoretical anymore, this will be infinitely more important than whether you've watched YouTube videos about making water filters. Because collapse doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in the context of other people also collapsing, also desperate, also armed, also thinking about survival. The only rational response isn't withdrawal, it's engagement with the new power reality. I want to be precise about something that makes people deeply uncomfortable. In the most severe historical collapses, the ones that actually threatened total civilizational breakdown, the people who survived best were often the ones willing to serve ruthless masters. They understood that total chaos was worse than hierarchy, even brutal hierarchy. They understood that a feudal lord who would hang you for theft at least guaranteed you wouldn't starve of exposure or be killed by roving bandits. This understanding created the social conditions for medieval feudalism itself, a system built on the recognition that rigid hierarchy and subordination were preferable to the alternative. The collapse preparedness industry wants you obsessing over emergency food and water purification, because that's what they can sell you. But the actual distribution of resources in any post-collapse scenario will be determined by power, not survival skills. If you control people, you control resources. If you're useful to people who control people, you survive. If you're neither, you're vulnerable, regardless of how many calories you've stored. This doesn't mean preparation is pointless. It means preparation needs to be radically reoriented. You're not preparing to be self-sufficient. You're preparing to be valuable. You need skills that matter to people with power. You need to understand how to assess power structures. You need to develop the psychological capacity to accept subordination when necessary and recognize opportunities for advancement when they emerge. These are survivable skills. Hoarding rice is not. The harsh truth is that every civilization that collapsed did so because those in power failed to recognize the difference between preparation and control. They prepared weapons. They prepared fortifications. They prepared for external enemies. What they never prepared for was the erosion happening inside their own structures, the rot that begins when people stop believing the system works for them. Look at Rome. The empire had more resources than any civilization before it. They had grain stores. They had military infrastructure. They had communication networks. Yet they fell not because supplies ran out, but because the people maintaining those systems stopped caring about maintaining them. Soldiers didn't defend the borders because they no longer believed in Rome. Citizens didn't support the government because they no longer believed they were part of anything worth supporting. The collapse came from the inside, not from external starvation. This is why understanding power dynamics is your actual survival skill. Every historical collapse followed the same pattern. First, the people with power become disconnected from the people without it. They live in separate spaces. They eat different food. They experience different consequences for the same actions. The gap widens. Then, the people without power stop investing in maintaining the system. They stop informing on dissidents. They stop reporting theft. They stop building and maintaining critical infrastructure. They actively work against it. Finally, the collapse happens not as an external invasion, but as a coordinated unwillingness to participate in the existing order. The survival skill you actually need is the ability to recognize when you're in that middle phase, when the disconnect is widening but hasn't yet become irreversible. Because at that moment, you have choices. You can position yourself closer to those in power. You can make yourself essential to their continued dominance. You can develop skills that matter regardless of what system emerges. or you can position yourself to be valuable to those who will challenge the existing order. History shows us that the people who survived systemic collapses were rarely the ones with the most supplies. They were the ones who understood the power structure deeply enough to navigate it. They were the scribes who could read and write, essential in any system. They were the craftspeople with irreplaceable skills. They were the people connected to multiple power centers, so when one fell, they could shift allegiance to another. They were the ones who saw the change coming and positioned themselves strategically rather than waiting to react. The most dangerous survivalist myth is that you can prepare your way out of systemic collapse through isolation and accumulation. It's seductive because it's something you can do alone. You don't need anyone's permission. You don't need to navigate complex social dynamics. You just buy supplies, dig a bunker, and wait. But history is absolutely clear. The bunker becomes a tomb if the society around it collapses into chaos. You're not surviving. You're just delaying when you become vulnerable. Real preparation means understanding that you are fundamentally dependent on others. That's not a weakness. It's the baseline of human existence. Acknowledge it. Then make sure you're valuable to people who will matter in whatever comes next. Learn skills that translate across systems. Learn how to assess power structures. Learn how to communicate with people who have power and people who want power. Learn how to be useful. These are the actual survival tools. The civilization you're living in right now is showing the first cracks. The disconnection between those with power and those without is visible everywhere. The institutions that held things together are being questioned. Some people are responding by buying more supplies, but the ones paying attention are repositioning themselves. They're developing valuable skills. They're building connections across different groups. They're making themselves essential. You don't need a bunker for this phase. You need clarity. You need to see the system as it actually is, not as it's supposed to be. You need to position yourself where you'll be valuable regardless of which direction things move. And you need to build relationships with people who matter. People with resources, people with influence, and people with nothing to lose. All three types are going to be important in what comes next. If you want a deeper analysis of historical power structures and how they actually work, I've put together an incredibly detailed resource in the description and pinned comment that walks through specific examples of how different groups position themselves during real collapses. It gets into the actual mechanisms that made survival possible when systems failed. Check it out if you want to understand this better. The final piece of this is psychological. You need to accept that survival in a collapsing system requires flexibility about your beliefs and your identity. The people who didn't make it were often the ones who held too tightly to who they thought they were. The merchant became too attached to being a merchant and couldn't adapt to being a soldier or a priest or a laborer. The aristocrat couldn't imagine being anything other than aristocratic. They died still holding on to their identity, while the world moved on without them. This is your actual survival strategy. Not supplies, not isolation, not hoping the system holds. It's understanding that you are part of a power structure, assessing where you stand in that structure, and being willing to move if the structure shifts. It's developing skills that matter in multiple systems. It's building relationships that transcend any single institutional framework. It's accepting that flexibility is stronger than rigidity. The people studying history and learning these patterns are already repositioning themselves. They're not talking about bunkers on the internet. They're quietly developing value. They're building connections. They're understanding the real mechanics of power. If you want to be ahead of the curve, stop collecting supplies and start collecting understanding. Stop planning for isolation and start planning for value creation within whatever systems emerge. The darkness in history teaches us that the survivors are never the ones who tried to escape the system entirely. They're the ones who understood it well enough to navigate it, exploit it, and position themselves to benefit from whatever comes next. That's not cynicism, that's clarity. And clarity is the most valuable survival tool you can possibly have. I know this episode probably didn't deliver the wilderness hacks or the bunker blueprints you might have been expecting, but I hope it gave you something far more valuable, the actual framework for understanding how survival works when systems fail. If you want the complete breakdown of specific historical collapses and exactly how different groups position themselves, check the pinned comment or the description for the resource that breaks this all down.